welcome everyone to this event, Feminist Foreign Policy for a Climate Just Future, question mark. It's wonderful to see you all here. My name is Lara Talsma. I'm a researcher at the Amsterdam Center for International Law and the Amsterdam Center for European Law. Today's event is part of a larger series by the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. It's called Gender and Sexuality in European Geopolitics. So our thanks go out to the Amsterdam Center for European Studies for supporting the organization of this event. And under the umbrella of this larger event, I, together with my co-organizers, Hanna Mühlenhof and Paula Cebulak, we organize an In Focus sub-series called A Feminist EU in the World, question mark. And in this sub-series, we explore what a feminist foreign policy for the EU could or should look like. We critically analyze the EU's foreign policy from a feminist perspective, but also challenge existing ideas for feminist foreign policies. And in the following sessions, we zoom in on various pressing matters related to the EU's foreign policy. For instance, in April, we discussed trade, and in May, we dive into peace building. But today, we take a closer look at climate change and climate justice in particular. And for this, we have three sublime experts joining us, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome and introduce you. I will do this in alphabetical order. First, Annica Kronsell. She's professor and chair of environmental social science at the School of Global Studies of Gothenburg University. She has a wealth of research and teaching experience in areas of climate and environment, but also in feminist theory. And she currently leads two very interesting projects called Gender Equality and Increased Energy Efficiency in the Transport Sector, and another one called Intersectionality and Climate Policy Making toward a Socially Inclusive Welfare State. So a very warm welcome to you, Annica. Then Andrew Telford, he's part of our humanities faculty here at the University of Amsterdam. He's assistant professor in European studies and focuses on climate change and conflict. As such, among other things, he looks into racial and gender identities and climate security discourses. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you for joining us today. And then thirdly, we have Margaretha Wewerinke-Singh. She's assistant professor of public international law at Leiden University. Her research focuses on the role of law in addressing sustainable development challenges. And in 2018, she received a Venny grant for her project Climate Justice Through the Courts. And she will use some of her findings from this project to enlighten us today. Also, warm welcome to you, Margaretha. Thank you for joining us. As for the program today, we will start with 2 rounds of moderated discussion by our panelists, after which we will take questions. And as I said, please submit your questions in the Q&A section of Zoom, and also include your name and affiliation, please. That'd be great. So let's start now, indeed, with your project, Margaretha. As I said, it's called Climate Justice Through the Courts. And in that project, you carry out social legal research on rights-based climate litigation. And as such, you've investigated numerous cases and situations in which human rights were violated as a result of climate change and climate policies. Can you give us a better understanding of the legal parameters, especially for the EU? When we talk about human rights, climate change, and climate litigation, and what are the rights and obligations we can work with? To what extent have legal procedures advanced tools or arguments that can be used in the fight against climate change problems?
Well, thanks for these questions, Lara, and thank you also for organizing this event. I'm very excited to be here. So just to give a little bit of an overview of the landscape, there are today a little bit over 80 cases in which NGOs or activists, citizens have filed claims against mainly governments. Some cases are filed against corporations, to challenge action or inaction that contributes to climate change based on human rights grounds. Most of these cases are still pending, the vast majority of them, but we do have some early results. So the first and still most prominent court victory was obtained in the case filed by the Urgenda Foundation against the state of the Netherlands, which probably most of you will know. The Urgenda Foundation is a Dutch environmental NGO. And this case used the European Convention on Human Rights, Articles 2 and 8, which protect the rights to life and to private and family life, as a basis for the argument that the Dutch government policy was insufficiently ambitious to protect inhabitants of the Netherlands against the adverse effects of climate change. And this case resulted in a court order that compelled the state of the Netherlands to cut its emissions by at least 25% against 1990 levels by 2020. That was a significantly more ambitious target than the 17% cuts that the government had initially wanted to make under its domestic climate policy. So it had a real impact on climate policy. And similar, though slightly more modest, victories were obtained by environmental groups last year in Ireland, in the Irish climate case Ireland, is popularly called, and earlier this year also in France, where the environmental NGO Notre Affaire à Tout sued the French government for what the NGO claimed was insufficiently ambitious climate policy, also based on human rights. So ultimately, the judgment in both cases, in Ireland and France, relied more on domestic law than it did on the ECHR. Now, within this pool of climate cases, what is particularly interesting from a feminist point of view is that an increasing number of these cases focuses on how climate change impacts different groups differently and certain groups disproportionately, including women. And within Europe, probably the most prominent example is a Swiss case that is filed by a group of elderly women in Switzerland, which is popularly known as the Klimasenjorinnen case. In this case, the women plaintiffs claim that the Swiss government is violating their human rights under the European Convention on Human Rights by failing to take adequate climate action. They claim that the climate policies of the state should be more clearly aligned with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And they submitted evidence demonstrating how elderly women are disproportionately impacted by events such as heat waves and health problems linked to climate change. And these impacts are already being suffered. The Swiss Supreme Court, so the case went all the way up to the Supreme Court of Switzerland, and the Supreme Court rejected it based on a rationale which you may say is a bit questionable. The Supreme Court essentially says that when as long as climate change doesn't reach 1.5 or 2 degrees, there is no remedy, then there's no violation. That is the threshold that we have agreed, and below that it's safe. So they essentially didn't really take the evidence very seriously. So what the plaintiffs have done is appeal to the European Court of Human Rights. So this is the second climate case that has now reached the Strasbourg court. And it's a space to watch closely, because even though if the court goes ahead and rules on the merits, so the substance of the case, which it will hopefully do, if that happens, then of course the judgment is binding only on Switzerland, but it will clarify the climate obligations under the European Convention of Human Rights of all parties to the European Convention, including all EU member states. So that will be a significant pronouncement. Now, in terms of EU foreign policy, so the cases that I just discussed were, of course, all mainly concerned with obligations of European states vis-à-vis their own citizens. But there is a small but growing number of cases that has a transnational dimension. And one case is particularly interesting. It's a case that is pending currently before the Court of Justice of the European Union. That case is brought by 10 families from across the European Union, as well as from Kenya and Fiji. And that case rests on a claim that the rights of these plaintiffs under the Charter of Fundamental Rights are being violated as a result of the failure of the European Union institutions to take adequate climate action in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is the first case to argue that the Charter of Fundamental Rights also protects people who live outside the EU if they are suffering because of the EU's activities or inaction. And another case with a transnational dimension was filed by Greta Thunberg and 15 other children before the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child against Argentina, Brazil, France, Germany, and Turkey. And that case likewise argues that states have extraterritorial obligations, in this case, not only to protect against future impacts of climate change, but also to ensure the child's right to be heard and to express their views freely in all forms of climate action. So it has this, emphasis on participation as well. So to sum up, most of the cases that rights-based climate cases are still pending. The outcomes remain uncertain. I've highlighted victories. There have been some losses as well. But what is very clear is that there's strong normative pressure on the EU and its member states to consider and respect, protect, promote human rights in all climate actions, including those affecting women abroad. And it's also worth noting that the EU and its member states, as parties to the Paris Agreement, have already agreed to do exactly this, because the Paris Agreement in its preamble, preambular paragraph 11, commits parties to the Paris Agreement to respect human rights in all climate actions and responses to climate change. So experience tells us that these commitments are extremely unlikely to be fully implemented without advocacy, various forms of advocacy, and litigation is one of those forms. But litigation alone, obviously, is not a silver bullet and will not solve anything. But these legal developments are certainly hooks that can assist those of us who are engaged in advocacy to try to promote the rights of women, including in the EU's foreign policy.
Thank you very much, Margaretha. I just learned that my sound wasn't too great. Just checking if this is better now. Yes? Okay, then I will continue. Thank you so much. I turn to Annica. We've just heard from Margaretha about several cases in which women were disproportionately affected and even additionally victimized through measures taken to address climate change-induced crises and violence, for instance. In your chapter on women, peace and security and climate change in the Oxford Handbook of Women, Peace and Security, which is edited by Sarah Davies and Jackie True, you zoom in on the emphasis on victimization and vulnerabilities often found in climate change discourses. And you also theorize these concepts in the context of climate change as a security concern. In the report that was drafted by the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, which is called a Feminist Foreign Policy for the EU. The Center argues that the EU should step up its efforts to address the increased, and then in brackets, human insecurity as a result of climate change. But in your view, to what extent would it be useful if the EU were to take on the approach of a feminist foreign policy, also with a view to these discourses on victimization, vulnerabilities, and human security or insecurity? And to continue, what would be essential for the EU to change from this perspective of a feminist foreign policy? And do you see any potential pitfalls to this approach?
Okay, thank you. Thank you for organizing this. Do you hear me well? Okay, good. Yes, great questions. And I'm excited about the EU taking on these issues. And you, of course, this work that you're all doing, it's fantastic. But of course, there's different ways to take this on. And in the book chapter that you mentioned, I argued that a human security perspective is a good way to approach the issue of climate insecurity. And the reason for that, I think it's because it's revealed through the empirical work on human security that when you take that approach, you can see how different individuals and groups are situated in what is a climate vulnerability or climate victimhood, so to speak. So I find it's a useful approach, but the way that I like to raise a critical dimension to that is also that when we look at human security, there is, of course, this focus on like human agency in a sense, but it's also a focus that highlights individuals and doesn't, and to the same extent that I would like to see it, highlight structures, right? So structures, institutions don't come into the picture. So the way that I like to approach this nowadays, it's more, I use an intersectional approach to illustrate this, which I find is the strength of the intersectional approach is that it problematizes privilege and marginalization, victimhood. So it kind of captures all that, or can capture that. That's how I like to work on it. So it shows then how different types of power relations interact. So it's not just about gender or woman or sex. It's also about class, age, able-bodiedness, place, ethnicity, etc., that come together in one human security situation, so to speak. And I think it's really important to look beyond gender in this discourse, although, of course, gender is important. It's not to downplay gender, but we know that these power relations interact. So on the one side, we understand particularly women in the South, and this is how it's been described. I'm not going to go into this in more detail, but often that they're the most vulnerable. Subsistent women in the South are most vulnerable, both for slow violences of climate change, that is droughts, access to water, heat, things like this, and also to the more immediate violence, we can say, of climate change in terms of storms, weather, fires, all these, because they are affected because of their kind of position in the structure of inequalities, right? So they are victims, and they are vulnerable to that extent because they are not economically resourceful, and they might have a very, if they live in a patriarchal society, very different or limited room for maneuver, so to speak, and limited resources to take on whatever is needed to escape those situations, to make your life better. They're very, very tied to the land too, in a sense, right? Particularly if you're looking at subsistence farmers, they're very tied to the land and nature to that respect, depending on it to work. So droughts, for example, affect very, very heavily these groups. But I think that we also need to look at how the fossil fuels, for example, the fossil fuel industry, and how the causation of climate change is also a power relationship, which looks quite different, right? Because it's about the rich, about maybe the white, and also about men that dominate this industry. But they don't only dominate the industry, but also the decision-making power. And there's, of course, decision-making power in many levels, including in the EU and in the EU countries in industry, decision-making, transport decision-making, cement industry, and all these are all male-dominated spheres. So something is happening there as well. So we need to look at the big picture to see that there are privilege and there's marginalization. So to understand this, I think we need to take a more structural perspective as well. And of course, we shouldn't forget that this marginalization is deeply unjust, right? It's deeply unjust, both in terms of who's affected, that I just mentioned, but also in terms of who has the responsibility. So for the problem in the first place, and who can do something about it. So there's multiple injustices here. So we need to keep that in mind at the same time as we are thinking about trying to understand the complexity more of these power relations, rather than just focusing on efforts to well, which is also, of course, important, but from a more analytical and theoretical point of view, not just to focusing on the victims, the marginalized women, and then on the other hand, trying to see that they're all going to save us, right? So there's also this idea about women as the saviors, because in a similar discourse about how women's transport behavior is a bit more sustainable, women's energy use is a bit more sustainable. So they're the ones that are going to take us out of this crisis. So those kinds of debates I find need to be unpacked. And of course, I can't unpack them here, but just open up sort of a box. And I find that an intersectional perspective on this is really quite important. And but if we then look to feminist foreign policy specifically, I think it's interesting, and I only know from the Swedish case because I have worked a little bit or looked at the feminist foreign policy and written at least one article about it. And when you see how that's been acted out in the Swedish context, it's been really focused on the 3 R's, I believe they call it, rights, representation, and resources. And in that focus, I find that it's a very, what we would probably call a liberal feminist approach to feminist politics. It's quite interesting in a Swedish context that it's taken that turn, but in any case, that's how it's been acted out. So it's really to secure women's rights to land, to their own income, and to rights in a general sense. We know that's a very important aspect, of course, of ameliorating the condition of women. Then of course we have the issue of representation, which is extremely important also to assure that women have a place in policy making, in climate policy making, but also in these other sectors and institutions where we're now going to be enacting all the changes. Like if you're looking at the EU New Green Deal, for example, which is then trying to put in place different measures, but are women involved in that as well? Do they get increased representation? That's of course an important issue. Then of course resources, the third one, is important in terms of particularly climate adaptation issues. It's really important to have access for anyone to have access. But I find that there is a problematic with just focusing on those 3 aspects, is because it doesn't really look at the structures of patriarchy. It doesn't look at the structure of, let's say, ecological modernization which have or do still really affect climate and environmental policy making in European countries and the industrialized world is about ecological modernization means that a lot of focus is on technocratic solutions, right? Innovations for new technologies that are going to save us from the climate problem. Efficiency arguments are really strong as well. So in this context, it seems to me that an approach, a liberal feminist approach, is wanting of some aspects that can address more the structures that are enabling climate change. And that the liberal feminist approach, it kind of goes along with ecological modernization. It's an approach that doesn't question, I would say, ecological modernization, but rather sees the empowerment of women as agents in the South as well as in the North through achieving the same kind of developments as men. So it doesn't question the society, the unsustainable society, but rather kind of assumes it. So I think that's something then for EU, for writing a foreign policy for the EU would be one that also questions that, so that it doesn't talk about women achieving the same rights necessary as men, only the same rights and the same resources and the same representation, but actually seeks to also challenge some of those structures that have kept patriarchal relations and institutions upholding those values, because we need to scrutinize also the transport institutions, the transport industries, the energy industries, that whole kind of sector needs to be addressed, because it is a threat, I would say, to a climate human security. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these thoughts. I think maybe we can dive into some of the elements you mentioned further down this discussion. But first, I'd like to turn to Andrew for your first input. Andrew, you recently published an article in Political Geography with the title "Climate Terrorism Assemblage?" exploring the politics of climate change, terrorism, radicalization, relations. In this article, you analyze climate security discourses, and in particular, you explore racialized masculinities in these discourses. What do you consider the implications of the racialized and gendered discourses for just decision-making in climate security politics, and in particular with a view to the EU?
Thank you for your question, Lara. Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you for the invitation to participate and talk on a very important topic with you guys. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully this works. So, cool. So, in relation to your question about the implications of racialized and gendered identities in climate security discourses, I guess I'll talk a little bit about the Centre for a Feminist Foreign Policy's report last year and their proposal for a feminist foreign policy for the EU, and then relate that a little bit more specifically to some of the work I've been doing around subjectivities, identity construction, and masculinities in climate security discourse. So firstly, in that report published last year, on page 48, the Centre for a Feminist Foreign Policy, particularly Bernarding and Lund's, note that the climate emergency is already impacting the human security of people across the world, in particular that of women in the global south. It reinforces structural discrimination of politically marginalized people, and that climate change, the climate emergency more specifically, acts as what they term a threat multiplier, which will exacerbate other types of security threats for human societies, states, communities, individuals, and so forth. As part of building alliances to find solutions, if that's the right word in this context, the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy states very clearly the need for an approach which centres and foregrounds climate justice as part of these debates. Upon reading this, I suppose my initial questions were, what is meant by threat multiplier, a term which is used frequently in European Union climate security discourses from 2008 with Javier Solana's and the European Commission's report on the security implications of climate change, through to the 2016 global strategy, through to the 2019 Commission communication on the European Green Deal, and last week to the announcement and publication of the Commission's climate adaptation strategy as well. All of these documents over a continuous period of time use the term threat multiplier, something which originates with US defense and security actors, particularly the Centre for Naval Analysis, writing about these debates. So firstly, what is meant by that term? Why is the idea of threat used to foreground security, something which to me suggests quite an antagonistic against us them approach to thinking about security, a threat against something to be secured? What is meant by human security in the context of the report? And perhaps more specifically in the context of the security debates that are noted by the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy, what kinds of political subjectivities are raised in these debates as well? So my work tying into this relates to the politics of causal claims which are made between temperature rises linked to anthropogenic climate change, the impacts that this then has on resource scarcities, food scarcities, water scarcities, scarcities of land, and so on, and then how political claims are subsequently made about how these scarcities will impact upon conflict, resource competition, the potential for migration, the potential for terrorism and extremism as well, as it's noted in these discourses. So what I've been particularly interested in is almost the arrows on this slide, I suppose, the causal connections, who makes them, where they are drawn, what the particular politics of those are. Now, in making this argument and exploring these causal connections, I have thought about how they could be conceptualized using assemblage theory. In particular, using Jasvier Poir's theory of terrorist assemblages and Manuel de Landa's account of assemblages as well, working with these two approaches together. And specifically how climate change, terrorism, migration, and radicalization, because they're often framed in this discourse, are connected, and what the causal politics are. Seeing these connections as an assemblage of material components, climatic changes, documents, discursive constructions, and so on. And specifically working with Poir's framework of framing a climate terrorist assemblage through the lens of intersectionality to look at how particular gendered subjectivities are constructed in security discourses, tracing the moments at which these subjectivities emerge, where causal lines are drawn between climate change, terrorism, and migration. So where are the lines drawn, and which subjectivities are constructed at the points at which these lines are drawn as well, building on Gayatri Spivak's work in particular in this regard. So I argue that as part of the discursive points where these lines are drawn, that you find a figure of particularly a young, male, frustrated, almost fatalistic subjectivity constructed, whereby you have impacts of climate change, you have the resource scarcities that follow from this, you have migration linked to this, impacts on livelihood insecurity, And the argument follows that this makes particular young masculine subjects more likely to become frustrated, more likely to lose their livelihood, and as a consequence makes them more vulnerable or more likely to join, to become radicalized, if that's the word used in a particular discursive context, and so on. So my argument would be that in particular moments of climate security discourses, masculinities, particularly racialized African Muslim male masculinities, are constructed in the areas where causal lines are drawn between climate change impacts, resource scarcities, and the potential impacts that that has for these potential subjects. So I argue that these particular moments, a masculinity, a particular type of masculinity and masculine subject is constructed in something which requires critical interrogation. And building on both Poir and on Chatterjee and Doyle's 2015 work on climate terror, post-colonial work on climate terror, I want to ask about whether the figure of the climate migrants in this situation, in these particular securitized discourses, becomes a figure which moves on to the climate radical, the climate terrorist, and so on. Is this a new type of subjectivity we see emerging in these discourses? Or is it perhaps not so new, drawing on existing racialized and gendered discourses, but is found in a new empirical and political context in climate change debates as well? In terms of implications for climate justice and thinking more specifically about climate justice and what this might mean in those contexts, I think firstly, building on a tradition of critical and feminist geopolitics scholarship, and from feminist studies of science as well, particularly Donna Haraway's work, there's a very important need to situate and think very critically about where these geopolitical knowledges, where these geopolitical forecasts and scenarios about who might pose a threat that might multiply in future, or what might pose a threat that might multiply in relation with other causal dynamics in future come from, what the power dynamics are to those discourses. In other words, who is it and what is it that is implicated in the drawing of these causal lines between climate change, resource scarcities, and then in some contexts, terrorism, radicalization, and other types of political violence and conflict. Secondly, I think building on what Annica was saying before, asking a little bit about human security and the underpinning normative focus on human security in a call for a feminist foreign policy, and what the human is constituted of in this particular call for human security. Who counts as being human in this context? Who does not count as being human in this context? Where are those othering divisions drawn in practice? And I think there are a couple of important questions here about gendered, racialized, classed subject formation. So one is around, yes, how racialized others are constructed that are viewed as threats to European climate securities at particular points in time, and the policy implications that follow from that, which we see, but also thinking a little bit, building on what Annica said in particular about people in privileged, powerful positions, for instance, in fossil fuel production, but also in discourses propagated by political elites in the European Union for the green economic recovery, for the European Green Deal. So I'm thinking, for example, of, I know the UK left the European Union last year, but of David Cameron's recent intervention to call for a muscular green recovery in the UK. He explicitly used the adjective muscular to describe the approach that Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, should take to describe that. And also perhaps the broader debates about the whiteness and the maleness of those who continually oppose and in their own interest oppose affirmative, positive climate actions, a kind of petro-masculinity, a white petro-masculinity, as Cara Daggett would call it in her own work. And then finally, I think building on what I was saying earlier about the geopolitics of these debates, who, what, and where constitutes the non-European others of an EU foreign policy, feminist or otherwise. In particular, do following what Betsy Harman writes about in 2010, 2015, 2017, do you find neo-Malthusian discourses coming into climate security politics, which reproduce particular ideas about conflict, about propensity to violence, which then are tied to particular racialized masculinities themselves, but also ideas about reproductive justice and about population growth too, in those neo-Malthusian discourses tied to longer narratives about population and politics of population as well. Secondly, what can we say about the racialized discourses on climate-induced migration? So I mentioned work before, but also by other scholars, for instance, Andrew Baldwin's work in these areas, and also about the particular spaces of violence, of otherness constructed as being outside of the remit of an EU foreign policy, whatever that might look like, if we have a kind of inside, outside, internal, external dimension, as you inevitably see with a call for a foreign policy. So just some quite broad general questions to end with, I think, but hopefully they create some food for thought for discussion later on. So I'll stop sharing my screen now and then, yeah.
Absolutely, a lot of food for thought indeed. Thank you very much for this. So let's continue with a few more follow-up questions. And perhaps also you want to respond to what some of the others have said here. For instance, Margaretha, Annica talked about rights and the rights approach by the Swedish feminist foreign policy that the Swedish government adopted. Also criticizing that, but yeah, in the work that you do, or in any case research, the rights-based approach is precisely kind of the big thing that people work with, that activists work with, human rights defenders, climate rights defenders work with. When we zoom in on that, when we look at the parties involved in that rights-based litigation, what does your research tell you about the collaboration with civil society, in particular with women's activists, in tackling these climate-based problems? And what role does international and EU law play in supporting or creating obstacles for civil society in that respect?
Yeah, great question. So what we see in this field is one of the most notable features of this, you can say, wave of rights-based climate litigation is collaboration, both at the national level and at a transnational level. So almost all of these 80+ cases that have been filed so far somehow builds on another case through collaboration, and emerge from collaboration with actors who had themselves already who were themselves already involved in similar litigation elsewhere. And women activists and rights defenders and other actors play a critical role in these cases, in many of these cases, in various ways. So we see women activists at the forefront of initiating cases and deciding on strategies. The very first rights-based climate case ever was filed by an incredibly strong and visionary Indigenous woman, Sheila Gauthier, against the United States before the Inter-American Commission for Human Rights. We see women as plaintiffs and supporters. We see incredible women lawyers leading the legal side of these cases. We see women flocking to courtrooms, sometimes women with children, expressing support for these cases. And we see women judges deciding these cases, and some of the best judgments come from women judges. I think I haven't done like a statistical analysis of this, but it's my impression that women are better represented and more influential in these various pockets of climate litigation spaces than in many other spheres. So that's interesting to contrast with the landscapes that you, Annica and Andrew, have observed, and the more male-dominated spaces and discourses. So I'm sure this I don't really do much theory myself, but I'm sure that there's a lot of interesting theorizing that can be done around this. And when it comes to the law, then we see international and EU law often forms the legal basis for claims pursued in these cases. And human rights provisions seem to be particularly suitable for pushing feminist agendas in the climate sphere, and are perhaps still underused to push these agendas. In terms of procedural rights at the European level, there's of course the Aarhus Convention, which creates obligations on EU member states to ensure access to information, participation in decision-making, and access to justice in environmental matters. And it's really uncontroversial that this treaty also applies to climate matters internationally, including the climate negotiations and foreign policy. So there's potential to use this instrument to raise issues relating to the EU's foreign policy, such as the need for additional funding and mechanisms to ensure that women are sufficiently included in national delegations and in civil society at the climate negotiations, for example.
Thank you for that. Yeah, very interesting to hear these very different angles indeed, coming from very different professional backgrounds. Annica, staying with this matter of agency, women's rights activism and women's agency. Also, you already mentioned power relations. How would you theorize women's agency when you look at power relations in foreign policy processes? And to what extent would a feminist foreign policy help the EU in that respect?
That's a difficult difficult question, because it lies kind of at the heart of the issue of we can say critical studies, let's say feminist critical work, and pragmatism of policy making. So, I mean, what we're doing here is somehow looking at, or what I've been doing is looking at feminist foreign policy and or climate issues really from a critical perspective. But of course, when it then is going to be foreign policy is much more of a pragmatism, right? So somehow, how can these two areas meet, and how can feminist thinking, intersectional thinking, critical masculinity studies inform concrete policies? And so I think we need to do both, try to keep those both things going at the same time. So in a sense, when I'm critical to the right, I'm not necessarily saying that we shouldn't have a rights approach. I'm saying more that it's not enough for us to address climate issues. There might be some other issues that we can address with it, and parts of it we can, but how can we produce something that's also radical, like in a sense, the trick being, how can we use it and still transform it, right? So of course the work of thinking about agency, like we just heard Andrew talk about different subjectivities, how through power relations we see how different subjectivities are articulated. I think that's extremely important for us to understand. What does a policy produce, in a sense, right? What does the foreign policy of the EU produce in terms of subjectivities, agency, right? So it produces it's been producing the vulnerable on climate, the vulnerable victims in the South, the women, and so forth for a long time. And now we're coming into a discourse where, at least in research, we're seeing this naming of the petromasculinities or hypermasculinity. We even have Martin Hultmann, who talks about ecological masculinities, how they're coming out, maybe with the European Green Deal, for example, when we're thinking about innovation, efficiency, you know, all these changes of our system. So these are the kind of subjectivities that are being produced, and of course Andrew was talking about then the often subject of foreign policy is the other in terms of the threats, the outside and so forth. So I think that we're seeing the agency now. I mean, I think even policymakers are kind of becoming alert to this, that it's not only about the vulnerable women in the South, but the issue is that, like Margaretha was speaking about, these older women in Europe, in Switzerland, I believe it was, that made this claim that that's also a certain climate subjectivity, we could say, or agency coming out of that they're seeing that, hey, this is something we're concerned about, and it's affecting us in certain ways. So I find it is really how these, I mean, this is kind of what you can do as a academic, in a sense. You can work on these things, and then you can somehow try to get that into a debate with the policymakers, because they, of course, have to be pragmatic, right? I mean, it's just simply difficult to create a feminist foreign policy that, for example, does not accept inside outside, which would perhaps be the feminist way, right? Would be to not have this division between nation and the outside, so to speak. But a foreign policy is, like, by definition, it's about that. It's about creating that border. So it's already contradictory in some sense to feminist work, but maybe that's also what the I say we, well, yeah, I hope that's okay. We have to be also pragmatic, that there has to be also this pragmatic approach while at the same time trying to transform it. And that's, of course, a very, very tricky thing. And I mean, one of the aspects that we need to have much more of, I believe, in all institutions, the foreign department, as well as the industry department, transport, environment, is more reflexivity, right? So we have to have enough time to think about, how does climate justice, or these policymakers, civil servants, need to have enough time in their time as they're working to reflect, how does this affect climate justice if I take this approach? So it's also something about the institutions that are problematic, that we need to also transform. So it's this kind of very, very tricky thing that we're working with here. So no clear answers, but yeah, some ideas.
Yes, thank you for that. And yeah, time is indeed a very difficult issue, especially in these times, where everyone's juggling multiple tasks and struggling with, you know, internet connections and so on. But aside from that, I guess we're still in a quite luxurious position. Andrew, final question to you before I open up the floor. I already have some questions in the Q&A. Can you zoom in on this agency element and the impact on agency of racialized and gendered assumptions that you talked about? How do you feel could an intersectional approach influence policy debates?
So I think, like, perhaps two overall general responses. One would be that I I think it's important to ask questions about collective identities and how they are formed in EU and other European and more broadly than that, climate change discourses. So, for example, in the EU's climate adaptation strategy released on the 21st of February last week, they talk about the need to build a climate resilient European Union, to build a climate resilient union. And I think that's a really interesting frame around which to develop as a collective entity, as a collective EU entity in the future. What does it mean to look at the EU and the EU's identity as an actor as being climate resilient? But I think in terms of intersectionality in that regard, it's very important to ask within that collective identity, if it's possible to kind of maybe reinforcing the thing I was talking about before, within and outside and so on, but like to ask what are the inequalities between different social groups within that collective formation? Who is it that gets to write and define what that collective identity actually is? What a climate resilient EU looks like in practice and is sold politically as well as an identity to be a part of or not to be a part of. So I think it's very important to use an intersectional approach to explore the connections between inequalities within that collective identity framing. That's very important. And in the strategy, the European Commission do note that climate change impacts unequally affect different social groups over others. And they mention differences based on age, on able-bodiedness, and on gender. But when they refer to gender, they use a binary men, women, gender definition in that strategy. So they do begin to note that those differences within the collective need to find a climate resilience, which is very important. And they also talk about the need for adaptation to be just and fair as well. So they use a language of justice to frame that desire for climate adaptation. I guess my questions from that would be, using an intersectionality framework, but what are the specific inequalities between different social groups in relation to adaptive capacity, in relation to adaptive needs? And also, what is your definition or your concept of justice underpinning that? What does it mean to be climate just in that context for the European Union? And there, I think it opens up loads of really interesting questions about what climate justice looks like. So it could be about what Margaretha was talking about before in relation to litigation in the courts, and age being something which was talked about as an inequality formed through that. It could also be broader questions about distributive justice that they mentioned with the uneven social impacts, as well as other kinds of questions about definition. But I think there's a kind of a lacking foundation there about what the concept of climate justice is underpinning the need for just transitions and just adaptation in terms of where the European Union goes forward with its adaptation policy and with its European Green Deal more generally as well. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much. Yes, great food for thought indeed. Margaretha, before I turn to questions, if you want to respond to that, the last bit about what is just, what is justice, do you have any thoughts, or is this something that you would like to ponder on some more before you answer?
Well, let me say that from an international law perspective, I think the answer that we get from existing legal sources is very disappointing, because the concept of climate justice is captured in the Paris Agreement, in the preamble, where it says, noting the importance of climate justice for some. And there is no definition of what climate justice is, but it is mentioned in the Paris Agreement, and that is significant. But international law really doesn't give much of an answer of what it means. So yeah, you'd have to be very creative in linking it to existing legal concepts. Of course, you know, you can provide many answers, but it will be interesting to see how the law on this evolves, because some of the cases do invoke climate justice as a concept. So we may get some jurisprudence on that, which will give a better idea of what is required. And my feeling is it will come from the global south, courts in the global south.
Thank you for that. I turn to what to me seems like quite a difficult question to all of you. It's quite long, so I'm just going to read it. It's by Lorenzo Angelini. He's at EPLO. In order to do no harm and to be sensitive to local realities, it is important for foreign policy engagement of any type, be it peace building, development, humanitarian, climate adaptation, trade agreements, security interventions, etc. It is important to be based on robust and locally informed or driven analysis of the country or region where actors are looking to engage. Do the speakers have any examples of frameworks for peace/conflict analysis that adequately integrate gender, climate change, and the intersection between the two, or perhaps of principles on which such gender-sensitive and climate-sensitive analysis should be based? Quite a long question indeed. I see a lot of thinking. Annica, you want to take the floor?
Yeah, that's a good question, but very difficult. But I can just mention, because we're working right now on a larger project proposal. So we've only done some very initial studies, but where we're looking at climate change adaptation, transboundary. We have different arguments why we look at transboundary climate change adaptation initiatives, and then trying to see how they can be peaceful as well. So we're arguing that in order to fulfill the sustainable development goals, they also have to be peaceful in a sense, right? They can't create, unjust in the sense that we've broadly spoken about it here. And one of the examples, because we try to find good examples of this, right? So one of the examples that we have focused on is the Great Green Wall in the Sahel area, where there has been some success and it has been locally, let's say, anchored or confirmed. So we're trying to use that as one of the examples that we will probe further together then with field work and in the local, should we get the funding for this. So that would be, it's not that easy to find good examples, but in our research projects, we want to start from good examples to be a bit more constructive, to produce more constructive research and not only critical. One example.
Andrew, I see you nodding. Do you want to add anything to that?
I don't know of any specific examples of a kind of climate sensitive and agenda sensitive analysis being integrated with projects on the ground. I think the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy's report and proposal for feminist foreign policy is perhaps a really interesting place to start. And it's I think usually in discourses on climate change and security in the EU context, I wouldn't normally see justice and security framed alongside each other. You'd see security discussed in particular terms, in terms of particular impacts, but I wouldn't normally see a justice angle brought in to that discussion. Perhaps with the exception of human security focused interpretations, which do bring in a justice angle as part of their framing. So I think what the report does offer is a really interesting interpretation of climate change, which, yes, uses the phrase threat multiplier, which I do think has issues with it, but it could talk about the idea of a risk multiplier or a climate change impact multiplier, which is one which exacerbates existing inequalities and builds on them across intersections of social groups, which I think is a really interesting way to think about climate change impacts. So not something which exacerbates threats necessarily to you or to something to be secured, but which is something which exacerbates inequalities, something which exacerbates injustices and highlights the intersectional relations between them on the ground. So I do think actually perhaps looking at the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy's report is a good start. It's a really interesting place to start in that regard. Yes, yes, maybe I've been quite critical of it, but at the same time, I think it's a really, really interesting place to start in that regard. So no, I don't know of any kind of concrete projects, I'm afraid, but I think that might be a good place to start in terms of where you might bring intersectionality and justice into a debate about conflict management, conflict resolution, and these sorts of security-based issues as well. Yeah.
Great, thank you. Margaretha, anything else you want to add to this? If not, I have another question for you.
Oh, yeah, sure. Well, I can briefly mention one example I know of, which is a project that was not accidentally then funded by the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. So it's very much part of Sweden's rights-based foreign policy. And that was in Vanuatu. When I was based in Vanuatu, I was involved in this. It was a 10-country study of the impacts of climate and disaster displacement on human rights. And so I was involved in the Vanuatu case study, and we looked at how the rights of women were affected or protected in the context of climate displacement. This was displacement after a cyclone, where inhabitants of a tiny little island were all evacuated to a bigger island. And we studied the involvement of women in decision-making around displacement. So we saw that none of the women were consulted. They were just presented with the decision of others that they were going to be relocated and it was going to happen now. And we noticed, for example, risks women faced in emergency shelters where they were exposed to risks of sexual harassment and so on, and no measures were taken to protect them. So that these kind of issues come out in this type of analysis. And then in terms of principles, of course, what you highlight is the rights that are being protected or violated, the agency of women, procedural rights, and the equality and non-discrimination dimension. So this is a framework, a human rights-based framework that is useful. It doesn't bring out or bring to the fore everything that matters for a feminist foreign policy, but it does get you to, I think it can help at least in addressing some of these issues, also linking it to governments and foreign and donors and international agencies' obligations under human rights law.
Thank you very much. To continue with you, I have a question from Laura Burgers at the University of Amsterdam. You touched upon this briefly when you mentioned the case that was filed by Greta Thunberg and other children. You have to see what parts of it you take up on. Are the rights of women indeed central in the climate cases? What do you think of the rights of children? Well, you mentioned it briefly. In the case against the EU that you mentioned, it is also argued that Article 21 regarding the right to equality applies intergenerationally as well. Can you zoom in on this as well?
Yeah, so to what extent the rights of women are central? Not so much, really. They're only central in one case. That is the case I mentioned, the Klima Signorine case. And other than that, in the climate litigation sphere, I think the potential of human rights law to promote the rights of women and promote feminist agendas is underutilized. The first UN Human Rights Treaty body to issue a statement on climate change was the Committee on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women in 2009. And so already at that time, the links between women's rights and climate change were quite clearly, I think, elaborated by the committee. And still we don't see much happening there in the litigation sphere. And that's quite different when you look at the rights of children. because there's really a wave of cases involving children and youth as plaintiffs, where this intergenerational equity dimension is highlighted. We have more than 24 of these cases where youth and children serve as plaintiffs. About half of those are filed in the US. Laura, as you probably know, that's mainly led by one organization, Our Children's Trust, which has filed several of these cases in many different courts in the United States. But we also have youth and children's-led cases in Uganda, Pakistan, Sweden, Norway, India, Colombia, Canada, Peru, South Korea, Germany, Mexico, and Australia. So really all around the world. What we see, I'm just writing an article about the disruptive potential of these cases, together with Sebastian Jourdain at McGill and two youth scholars, Larissa Parker and Juliette Maitre. And what we find is that in many of these cases, especially the cases that are litigated in the global north, courts throw out these cases on procedural grounds. So they never look really at the merits of the case. And yeah, that, of course, undermines the disruptive potential of these cases, even though there is some disruptive potential just by because of the sheer fact that governments are being sued. But it is problematic in that it denies the children their voice to an extent, and also redress. But there are also some victories, and the most notable one is in the Colombian case, Future Generations versus the Ministry of Environment and others, where the court recognized the rights of future generations. And it also it awarded remedies that are very significant. So not only did it agree with the youth and children's plaintiffs that the Colombian government had to take measures to stop deforestation, but it also agreed that children had to be involved in deciding on how that was going to be done. So the court ordered that there needed to be an intergenerational plan created with the full participation of youth in deciding on how to achieve that.
Thank you. This is a very helpful question, I think, indeed. Oh, yes, as Laura says in the chat, thank you for this great answer. I have another question from Paula. We have a little more time to answer this. This is from Paula Chabelak, also at the University of Amsterdam. Her question is, from a perspective of strategic advocacy, can the combination of feminism and climate change cause it to be beneficial or disadvantageous? For instance, do you think that framing climate change as an issue of minorities could antagonize certain existing political and institutional platforms? Anyone who this question resonates with?
I can speak to it. Okay. Can I talk?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Go ahead, yeah, take the floor.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question. I think it certainly probably can, but I think also the perspective that I use, the intersectional perspective, which is the way that I use it, is more like a methodology or a way to analyze power relations and kind of expose those, and then for the specifics you go to maybe to other theories. It's not really a proper theory that way, but it's more an analytical framework for academic research, for example. But I also think that intersectionality, I mean, it comes from the feminist movement, and it's also really important to show to open up for alliance building, right? So that if you understand how people are situated, or different groups are situated differently, around a climate issue. It can be in a particular context, of course. That's also a way that you can mobilize, right? So you can see that there are overlapping maybe interests for, let's say, young people and women's groups, or other environmental groups, or possibly other types of groups can come together and then become stronger. So it's also, I think, an opportunity for alliance building in that way. But it's, of course, can be very, I mean, we work with, in this project that Laura mentioned, we're trying to work actually with institutions and policymakers to see how can they possibly take in intersectional thinking, issues of equity, justice into their work. How can they do that in their mundane, basically bureaucratic work? And it's an extreme challenge, because some will argue that it's all about politics. So this is politics, and we can't do that because we're doing infrastructure planning, right? So we can't work with justice issues because we're doing energy systems. We're organizing energy system. But of course, we, or I, who am a critical researcher, see that there is the politics and a lot of politics in infrastructure planning as well. But this is, of course, the difficulty in trying to use these types of perspectives as problematizing approaches in more, let's say, in policy making, for example. But the way we see it is that at least there's a dialogue. I mean, the first step is to bring it up, to discuss it, to see it, to expose and educate, in a sense, right, about these differences that, for example, in the Swedish context, large differences between the rural and the urban conditions in climate issues, and particularly in climate adaptation issues. So for mobilization, I think it can be very useful, but also as an analysis of power. And that's mainly how I use it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anyone else who would like to respond to that question?
I can briefly, unless you want to go first, or...
Oh, please go first, Andrew.
Just to agree, basically, and say that whilst sometimes I see a framing of kind of how are kind of issues of gender inequality, feminism linked to climate change when they're seen as sort of separate, non-overlapping magisteria sometimes, or you hear the same debates around racism, anti-racist claims for justice and climate change. How could they be linked? They're seen as fully different things. I think that's a logical error, empirically and conceptually. And I think that's one thing that an intersectional feminist approach really helps to highlight quite clearly, that you can't really view climate change and its impacts irrespective or differently to the ways in which they are melded into, the ways in which they inflect, the ways in which they increase or enhance social, economic, political inequalities as well across lines of race, gender, class, nation, and so on. So I think I would just kind of agree, and although sometimes you do see this framing of, why would you link these two separate issues together? I think it's kind of, from sometimes you see it in the press. I think it's a kind of just a logical error, and something which an intersectional feminist analysis really helps to prove and demonstrate as a logical error quite clearly, I think.
Margaretha?
What I would say is very, very similar, that of course you antagonize certain people if you link these agendas, because it will be even more unpalatable to, and especially, ultra masculine, right-wing conservative groups. No coincidence that those who brag about harassing women are also often climate deniers. but these issues are too important to ignore. So they're the intersection. So as you both said, analytically, it's important to understand the language, the linkages, because of the real links between the exploitative neoliberal capitalism and patriarchy, which are really intertwined, and as a matter of principle as well. Again, that in speaking from a human rights perspective, rights are inalienable, and there's no way you can do one thing or the other, addressing the climate crisis, or addressing gender inequality and other inequalities. So it has to happen. It's both these agendas are urgent, and indeed, as you both said as well, alliances are important, and our chances increase when we work together as different groups.
Excellent, thank you very much. I think we have time for one final question, or it's actually two questions in one. It's by Hannah Meulenhof at the University of Amsterdam. The EU's approach to climate change, also internally, has been very much focused on market-based instruments. This is also often a danger when we use the human security concept and discourse. So one question is, how can a feminist approach challenge these ideas? And then maybe how does climate change litigation speak to challenge such market-based approaches? Who can I give the floor first?
I'm happy to say something very briefly, that on the climate litigation point. So climate litigation so far, when it comes to market mechanisms, has looked mostly at the negative impacts of offsetting on the ground, where the offsetting happens, where human rights violations have occurred as a result of mega projects that result in emission credits that are, of course, lucrative, and also like land grabbing as a result of reforestation projects and these things. The concept of offsetting as such, and the perverse effects that it can have, also on a structural level, have not been sufficiently addressed in climate litigation, I would say. And it's a little bit tricky, of course, because the law provides for such offsetting. So the arguments to say that this is legally valid are very strong. But there's certainly space to, I think, to challenge that notion in the courts. But it would be an uphill battle, just because, unfortunately, the law locks it in.
Sorry, anyone else on this question, or any other remarks you want to make triggered by any of the questions or anything that the other speakers said? Yes, Annica?
I mean, I'm not sure I understand the question fully, but what I would like to add is, of course, the market-based instrument concentration of the EU and also the EU member states to a large extent is, I mean, it's part of ecological modernization, and a strong emphasis on efficiency, technical innovation, and that's market-driven, basically. A market-driven climate or decarbonization is perceived to be market-driven. So it's kind of within that ideology. And what I see, I mean, there is some challenges now to this. And I mean, of course, you have the degrowth movement, which is challenging this, but also like the circular economy has some kind of potential to challenge that. And then, of course, there's the feminist economics. For long, they've pointed to also some critical. They're very critical of ecological modernization, for example. So there is a lot to be said, and there's the donut economics, and there's different visions and versions of this out there in the debate, and I think being increasingly maybe listened to, at least in some parts of Europe.
Thank you very much. Andrew, anything you would like to add to this question or anything else?
Not really. Maybe perhaps just to say the discourse on resilience is quite interesting in relation to market-based mechanisms to an extent, and how maybe a neoliberal discourse is attached to or is linked to individual entrepreneurialism, becoming climate resilient through business development and that kind of idea, and need to think quite critically about how neoliberal ideologies can be tied to discourses of climate resilience as well, but nothing really more than that.
Okay, well, it's almost time as well. So I'm just, I will briefly look at all your faces to see if there's like one final remark that you would like to make, or a final question that you would like to raise. No? May? Okay. Well, in that case, thank you very much for joining us today. First of course, the speakers. Thank you so much for your very interesting contributions. I greatly enjoyed it myself. I hope all the attendants did as well. Thank you, participants, for the great and interesting questions. I include in the chat the link to our series, where you can find the recordings of this session soon, but also the recordings of other sessions that we've had, plus the upcoming events that we are still have. As said, in April we will have another event on trade, and in May we will discuss peace building. So also you can, through this link I just included, you can sign up for a newsletter so that you are, excuse me, up to date on what we are doing and the events that we'll be organizing. So again, thank you so much, everyone. It was a pleasure to have you all, and I look forward to seeing you in our next event.